Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the NEA's webinar on evaluation as a tool for creative placemaking. My name is Patricia Shaffer. I will be your host today, and I am the Deputy Director of the NEA's Office of Research and Analysis. Today, our lineup of guest speakers will highlight the role of evaluation in 3 different creative placemaking projects and discuss approaches to the development of theories of change, which describe how and why a desired community change is expected to happen, and how the arts are linked to the results the projects are expected to achieve. For today's webinar, please note that the sound has been muted for all participants on the webinar. In a moment, I will share more information on how you can submit questions during the webinar. This webinar will be recorded on arts.gov. Looking ahead at our schedule today, I'll kick off the discussion by talking about using evaluation methods as a tool to support creative placemaking. We'll be discussing the internal work we've done here at the NEA on developing a theory of change for the Our Town grant program. Following this brief presentation, Rachel Engh of Metris Arts Consulting will discuss the Arts on Chicago and Arts Blocks Theory of Change Development and Impact Study, which also used a theory of change approach as a prelude to an impact study of a creative placemaking project. To examine the project's impact, the evaluator used data previously collected by the provider and also collected new data through a resident survey designed with a quasi-control group, social network analysis, and a focus group. Following Rachel, the Go Collaborative's Lynn Osgood discusses how the research process itself can become a more integrated component of arts-based community development projects. Her impact study of Forklift Danceworks' 3-year initiative on civic capacity building for minority and low socioeconomic populations in Austin, Texas, uses research practices that span from traditional techniques to more participant-led data gathering and coding efforts. Lastly, Catherine Bray-Simons of the NEA's Design Office will discuss a funding opportunity to build knowledge about creative placemaking. There will be an opportunity to ask questions of each or all of the speakers following Lynn's presentation. You are welcome to submit questions at any time, but we will hold discussion until that later time. To submit questions on your webinar screen, please look for the Q&A link at the top of the screen. Since you'll be hearing our voices and watching our slides today, we thought you'd like to see who's leading our discussion. I'd like to thank Rachel, Lynn, and Catherine for taking the time to join us today. So to kick off our discussion today, I will discuss the behind-the-scenes work the NEA has done in the development of a theory of change for the Our Town program. I know many of you online are familiar with this program. It was launched in the 2010-2011 fiscal year to support creative placemaking projects that help to transform communities into lively, beautiful, and resilient places. Knowledge building grants, which Catherine will discuss near the end of today's presentation, were introduced later to help build the field of creative placemaking. The agency is proud of the 400-plus grants we've made since 2011. What is creative placemaking? The NEA, through its Our Town guidelines, defines it as when artists, arts organizations, and community development practitioners deliberately integrate arts and culture into community revitalization, placing arts at the table with land use, transportation, economic development, education, housing, infrastructure, and public safety strategies. Our Town projects are highly varied, reflecting the needs and assets of the local communities. In the Arts Quest Our Town project, the former Bethlehem steel plant was transformed into a performing arts and independent film and jazz cafe. The Rising Tide Community Loan Fund was involved in funding a new public television station at Steel Stacks. Outside of Washington, D.C., this Our Town project involved artists in community planning processes, such as these neighbors doing their own interpretive dance to inform the planning of the redesign of a nearby highway. In North Carolina, Our Town supported the restoration of Wallace Simpson's 200-foot tall whirligigs, placing them in a new environment, a downtown park, to create a new tourist site, and in the process giving local unemployed residents new jobs in arts restoration. Our town grants can now be found across the country, so the time was right for the NEA to harvest what we had been learning through these diverse projects. One of the evaluation tools we use at the NEA is theory of change. This tool provides a method of understanding the big picture of projects and programs, their intended outcomes, the issues or context of the projects or programs, and the strategies they employ. What you see on screen is a simplified theory of change for a creative placemaking project from an Our Town grantee, the Sugar Hill Arts District in Detroit. Beginning on the left, we look at community needs. Even though Sugar Hill is centrally located in Midtown Detroit and has a storied history as an arts and entertainment district, over the years, the area has become more associated with parking and its in-between spaces than as a place unto itself. The strategies associated with their Our Town project included the development of a landscape arts master plan that articulated a strategy for the role of art in stimulating cultural and economic development in the district. The staging of public events and festivals was another key strategy. As a result of this project, as you'll see on the right, greater foot traffic was realized, which was theorized to lead to more retail development and ultimately a revitalized local economy. With over 400 grant projects awarded since the Our Town program began, the design team at the NEA was interested in harvesting the data to better understand Our Town, how grantees implemented their projects, what were common inputs to the projects, and what were the project's outcomes. But how do you make sense of the diversity and creativity of these projects when each Our Town project is as unique as the community that developed it? The NEA convened a group of evaluation experts, mostly drawn from other federal agencies that had place-based initiatives. This group of experts recommended that the NEA develop a theory of change that would help us to improve tracking of outcomes. The theory of change development proved to be a substantial task, given the diversity of Our Town projects. This work was undertaken by an external evaluator, 2M Research Services and Metris Arts Consulting. Initial steps in the development of the theory of change are listed on the far left. First, analysis of grantee final report data. By analyzing information gathered from grant reports, we were able to articulate project inputs, strategies, and outcomes with the ultimate intent of creating a theory of change. We also interviewed external experts in federal government and the private sector who brought insights in evaluation design and measurement to place-based initiatives. Lastly, we conducted a scan of evaluation reports, tools, and other resources related to the evaluation of place-based initiatives. From these sources, the team, which included NEA staff working with the external evaluator, identified Our Town program inputs, both at the project and program level, as well as common strategies, tactics that were used across Our Town projects. We also identified outcomes Our Town grantees reported and potential outcomes that were revealed during the interviews and in the program scan. These became the raw materials for the theory of change and the logic model. And now for the grand unveiling, the theory of change for Our Town. This theory of change describes at a high level how and why a desired change is expected to happen in a particular context. It is focused in particular on mapping what the Our Town program does and how its activities lead to the desired system-wide change. This theory of change is read from the bottom up. It includes a problem statement that emphasizes a variety of challenges faced by local communities and that arts, culture, and design-based strategies are often underutilized locally. The theory of change also conveys the program goal, which is visible here as the topmost element. The program goal emphasizes systems change to support increased uptake of arts, culture, and design activities in community development. The theory of change also situates the Our Town grant-making program amid complementary work conducted by the NEA and also national and local leaders. The Our Town grants are illustrated as one element of the NEA's overarching creative placemaking program, which encourages the dissemination of promising local practices and links our town grant activities to larger field building efforts. The NEA works in concert with other funders, non-arts network leaders in community development, and other thought leaders to strengthen the field of creative placemaking. In the theory of change, these complementary activities are presented in the local leaders and national leaders boxes to the left and right of the model. To prove successful, our town projects also require the local inputs of leadership, partners, financial resources, and community buy-in. Our town project grantees and their partners pair specific creative placemaking strategies with one or more arts, culture, or design-based tactics. When we take a look at these strategies, which you'll see approximately in the middle of the slide to the right, I will highlight each of these for you. First, illuminate. To inject new or additional energy, resources, activity, people, or enthusiasm into a place, community issue, or local economy. Energize. To inject new or additional energy, resources, activity, people into a place, community, issue, or local economy. Imagine, envision new possibilities for a community or place, a new future, a new way of overcoming a challenge or approaching problem solving. And finally, to connect, to bring together communities, people, places, and economic opportunity via physical spaces or new relationships. Our town projects help generate economic, physical, and social changes in local communities. Both the process of undertaking our town projects and the positive local changes they engender build community capacity and ultimately can advance systems change at the local level to sustain the increased utilization of arts and culture and design in community development. In some projects, this local systems change is also an intentional as well as a direct outcome. What you're looking at on screen now is the program logic model that was developed for our town. This was a follow-up step to developing the theory of change. At first glance, the logic model resembles the theory of change in its key elements. However, while a theory of change is a high-level description of a program's change process, a logic model is more in the weeds and is often used to guide planning for performance monitoring, measurement, and evaluation. Here, the logic model reflects project-level context, inputs, activities, and outputs to illustrate the ways in which they aggregate and culminate to influence systems change. The overall components remain the same from the theory of change, but now we see more details, such as a summary of the arts tactics used by our town partners, as well as a selection of projected outputs and outcomes. So what's next for the NEA? The evaluation methods we used yielded the theory of change and logic model and laid the foundation for modifying the reporting requirements for future Our Town grantees. We also fully anticipate that this work will be reflected in future guidelines for the Our Town program. But more importantly, we look forward to continued discussion with the broader creative placemaking field on how this work might continue to be refined. The NEA's work provides us with an example of using an evaluation tool to support program planning. But I hope it's also easy to see how this approach might translate to a local project as well. To better illustrate that point and also to show us how our theory of change development sets the stage for project evaluation, I'm delighted to welcome Rachel Engh to discuss the evaluation of Pillsbury House and Theater's creative placemaking projects. Rachel, we are transferring control of the PowerPoint over to you.
Thanks, Patricia. And thanks everyone for joining the webinar today. I am going to talk about a project that I was involved with my colleague Ann Gadwa and Nicodemus, as well as the staff of Pillsbury House and Theater, and we evaluated a couple of their creative placemaking programs, Arts on Chicago and Arts Blocks. And this is the cover of the report that we produced with Pillsbury House and Theater. And I just wanted to mention that Pillsbury House and Theater is a pretty unique organization. It's located in South Minneapolis. It's a hybrid arts hub and social service provider. They really incorporate arts and culture into everything they do, and it's not just traditional arts programming, although they do have a theater in their space in South Minneapolis. And in 2012, they got an Art Place grant, and they started doing creative placemaking work. And we focused on two of their programs, Arts on Chicago and Arts Blocks. And Arts on Chicago was really, their projects revolved around this major thoroughfare in South Minneapolis, Chicago Avenue, and they worked with artists, got grants, artists who lived in the neighborhood, and then to do such projects as like a stilting club, bike racks, a story walk where artists collected stories from community members and created a walking performance based on these stories. There was a poetry mobile where people could type poems in a typewriter that was on wheels. And then there was also another program called Arts Blocks, and this was very much a more micro scale. So similar to like block leaders, there was an artist who was charged with engaging the people on their blocks in creative ways. So there were backyard puppet shows, murals painted on fences. So really a wide variety of arts and culture and creativity happening with these creative placemaking programs. Pillsbury House had already been doing a lot of this work before they engaged Metris to work with them, but they also had been thinking about evaluation for a good while. They had a hunch and they had collected this anecdotal data that their creative placemaking work was impacting the community. And unlike some of the indicator systems that came out when they were first beginning this work that focused more on economic or physical impacts, Pillsbury House was really interested in the social outcomes of this creative placemaking work. So what's the people stuff that's happening because of the arts and culture going on in the neighborhood? And with these creative placemaking programs, they ultimately hope to empower neighborhood residents, including artists who lived in the neighborhood, to effect positive change. And Pillsbury House had identified a couple of ways that this positive change would happen. So increasing access to arts and culture, fostering attachment to community, and nurturing agency, both community and individual agency. But we really wanted to make sure that everyone was on the same page about what these terms meant, access, attachment, and agency, and then really to nail down the theory about how these impacts happened. So one of the first things we did with Pillsbury House, it was very much a collaborative effort, was that we created this theory of change, and we vetted it in an interactive workshop with core stakeholders, which included Pillsbury staff and also some of their the leadership team that was involved with these creative placemaking programs. So I know this is pretty small, but I just wanted to walk through it to give you a sense of what this theory of change entails. So on the far right, it's the desired highest level of impact. So really, as I had mentioned before, they hoped that people would make good stuff happen in the neighborhood, that they were empowered to do this good stuff. So how do we get to this desired level of impact? Well, now I'm working from right to left along the theory of change. So, and the bottom of this next column, of the how column, we have agency. So for good stuff to happen, we needed to have people feel like they could make this stuff happen. So what we mean by agency is having people feel empowered, inspired, and having this collective efficacy across difference. So how do we cultivate this agency? Well, it's about feeling attached to the community and having access to arts and culture. And what we meant by attachment was social connectedness, appreciation for difference, sense of belonging, and pride of place. And by access, we meant feeling welcome, that there's enough art stuff to participate in, and a shift in attitudes regarding arts participation. So then we thought we needed to kind of explore what drives these feelings of access, attachment, and agency. And so now I'm moving left again to the next column here. So we needed to have arts activity. And we thought about arts activity in terms of direct participation and even just proximity to a critical mass of opportunities to participate in arts and culture. And then moving along left again, this whole theory of change really depends on eliminating racial and class barriers to arts participation. This was really important for Pillsbury House to do. And then, finally we have the artists involved in these creative placemaking programs. They participated in training about how to design projects that help to eliminate barriers and also drive this access, attachment, and agency. So this is our theory of how we could get to the good stuff. So we had our theory, and then we needed to explore if we could prove this theory to be true. So we developed research questions related to all the components, the attachment, access, and agency. And I won't go over all of our research questions here, but I just wanted to give an example of one. So, our hypothesis was that these creative placemaking programs were driving attachment, and so we flipped that hypothesis to form this research question. So is there evidence that residents feel more connected to or trust their neighbors more because of arts activities? So that's just one example of how we created a research question. And we had several that pertained to each of the three buckets that we were interested in exploring: attachment, agency, and access. So now that we had these research questions, we needed to figure out how to answer them. And luckily, Pillsbury House, as I mentioned, they were very interested in evaluation before we even started working together, and they had collected a lot of data. And so I show you this slide. It's from our technical appendix, which is available online. So I invite you after to check it out. I know this is quite small, but it lists all the data sources that we relied on, and it also includes details about each data source. For instance, the date that it was collected, the target population, response rates, any notes that we thought were important to include. And then for each data source, we also included a narrative about the pros and cons of each data source and any opportunities for improvement. And we did this because we knew Pillsbury wanted to keep doing its evaluation work even after we stopped working together, and they needed to do it largely in-house. So we wanted to build their capacity to do this evaluation work themselves and to tweak some of the tools that they were already using and to keep using some of the tools that we would develop with them. We also made this technical appendix public to build the field's knowledge around evaluation. So if you look at the technical appendix online, it also includes actual protocol that we use for some of our data sources, like the questions we asked for focus groups and surveys, in an effort to maybe inspire other folks who want to do this work, and they can build on the work that we already did with Pillsbury House. So we had all this data that Pillsbury had already collected, and we combed through it, and we realized after combing through it that we still couldn't answer all of our research questions based on the info that they had. So we would need to do some original data collection. And today I'm just going to touch on a couple of tools that we use to collect original data with Pillsbury House. The first one was a survey that we gave to residents in the 4 neighborhoods surrounding Pillsbury House and Theater. Pillsbury is really a community-centered organization, and they strive to not just serve people in these 4 neighborhoods surrounding their physical location, but beyond too, but they really are focused on their immediate neighborhood. And so we realized that through the data that Pillsbury had already collected that we didn't have a lot from the people who lived in these neighborhoods. So we decided to design a survey to ask them some questions around access, attachment, and agency. And one thing we did with the survey was that we had control blocks and then we had quasi-control blocks. And this was an effort to, well, since we entered our relationship with Pillsbury after they had already done a lot of arts and culture creative placemaking work. We didn't have an opportunity to get baseline data or data that we collected before any activity happened, so that we could get that baseline information about how people are feeling before any arts and culture stuff happened. But we thought that we could kind of do this by surveying people on blocks where arts activities did happen, and then surveying people on blocks where arts activities had not happened yet. And we chose blocks where arts activities hadn't happened, but we knew would happen in the future because there were going to be more iterations of this Art Blocks program, and we knew that coming up some of these blocks would have arts interventions, and so Pillsbury could use some of this data as baseline data and go back after this arts activity had happened and ask these same questions and see if anything had moved the needle there. And we decided, ultimately to do this control and quasi-control survey because, our hypothesis was that these creative placemaking programs were moving the dial on people's feelings around attachment and agency and access. And so we wanted to see if, in fact, there were differences based on if people lived on blocks where arts activities happened or not. And so we really tried to make our survey accessible to the most people as possible. These neighborhoods have a pretty high population of Spanish speakers, so we translated our survey into Spanish, and we had at least one Spanish speaker on the survey team that went out and did this door-to-door. It was a door-to-door survey, so we were knocking on doors. Knocking on doors. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. So it's actually the treatment group. Those were the blocks that had arts activities that had already happened, and those were the blocks that we surveyed, as well as these quasi-control groups. So a few slides ago, I mentioned how we created research questions, and I just wanted to also point out how we created the survey question from the research question. So, for example, our example research question was, is there evidence that residents feel more connected to or trust their neighbors more? And then a corresponding survey question would be, I feel more connected to my neighbors because of arts offerings. And then they had a range of responses, disagree to agree. And I just wanted to touch on one result of this survey. So as I mentioned, we had our treatment blocks. Those were the blocks that had arts blocks or Arts on Chicago activities, and then we had our quasi-control. And so we did actually find some differences in terms of if people lived on blocks where arts initiatives had happened. So for example, this first line here, I feel more connected to my neighbors because of arts offerings. A higher percentage of people who lived on blocks where these arts stuff had happened answered, yes, I do feel more connected to my neighbors because of art offerings, versus the people who lived on the blocks where arts activities had not happened. So that was one tool that we use, one data source. Another one that I wanted to touch on briefly was social network analysis. So we also use this tool to answer our research questions around attachment, specifically social connectedness, and with an eye towards social connectedness across difference. And so Pillsbury House was interested in this sort of network analysis. They had asked their artists to keep track of all the people that they connected with over the arc of their project. And we worked with a social network specialist, Christopher Mascaro, who took all of this data about the connections that artists had made and did this social network analysis. So the image I'm showing here shows some of the artists involved in the creative placemaking programs of Pillsbury House and Theater. And the larger the dot under an artist's name, the more connected they are. So we found that artists were connected to each other, which is really no surprise because they went through training together. But they also were connected to other people in the community. And so we found, there's this cohesive group of artists, the ones that have a lot of these connections radiating out of the center, and they really act as a hub to bring together a lot of disparate individuals in the community. And these artists exist within a highly centralized network. And I don't want to get too deep into the kind of technical aspects of social network analysis. That you could read about that in our technical appendix. But we also identified people who play the roles of connecting different parts of the network. Those are people who have high levels of betweenness. So that means that they're in the middle of a number of subgroups, and without those individuals, the network might splinter into multiple parts. So those people are really key. And actually, through this analysis, we realized that some non-artists were popping up as people who had a lot of connections to the artists. And we thought, oh, okay, who are these people? So we decided to get a few of them together for a focus group to ask. We thought that they could help answer some of our research questions too, as non-artists, but who were very involved or involved in some way with multiple artists. So we asked some questions about their involvement with the creative placemaking programs, if they felt stronger feelings of access, attachment, and agency, and we just explored some of our research questions with them. So I share that story because, even though we came in after Pillsbury had already completed a lot of creative placemaking work, our process was still really iterative with them. With the resident survey, we realized that we didn't have a lot of data from residents, so we made the survey, and then through the social network analysis, we identified this group of non-artists who were very involved, and we explored their involvement through a focus group. Pillsbury House was also inspired by the social network analysis, and they actually used it in one of their monthly conversations with artists, and they made their own personal maps of what a healthy and thriving community would look like and explored their roles within that community. And Molly Van Avery, who manages one of the creative placemaking programs, even wrote a poem that was inspired by this conversation that artists had based on this social network analysis. So those were a couple of tools that we developed with Pillsbury House and Theater for this evaluation. And even after we left, we finished up this project, Pillsbury has continued to practice evaluation methods. They were part of an EMC Arts Innovation Lab cohort that allowed them to explore more artistic and creative means of data collection and evaluation. And they've also adapted some of the tools that we helped design for them and used in other parts of their organization to kind of try to have some consistency of questions across their organization. So I welcome any questions. I think we might be doing that at the end, and thanks for listening.
Rachel, thank you so much. And I also wanted to thank all of you online who were having some challenges with some of the background noise. I think we have resolved the issue, so I thank our web team for that. So now I'm pleased to introduce Lynn Osgood. As I mentioned earlier, Lynn will be discussing how the research process itself can become a more integrated component of arts-based community development projects. And just a reminder that we're holding questions until after Lynn's presentation, but you are encouraged to click the Q&A button that you'll find at the top of your screen to submit questions. Lynn, we welcome you to the podium.
Thank you, Patricia and Rachel, and thanks to everyone for being here today. So I wanted to present to everyone the project that we're working on in Austin, Texas. It's called My Park, My Pool, and My City, and it's a project being done by Forklift Danceworks. And my firm is Go Collaborative. And so this project that has emerged just over the past couple of years focuses on the City of Austin's pool. And I wanted, before we get into talking about the theory of change development and the evaluation process, and really our own process of developing that while the project is going on, I wanted to give everyone a basic orientation to what the project itself is. So the two main artists of Forklift Danceworks are Allison Orr and Chrissy Marty. Now, Forklift Danceworks has been around and creating dances for over 15 years, and in their work, they focus on working with city staff and supporting community members and creating performances that really celebrate the performers' work and their everyday lives. Generally, they present to large-scale site-specific settings for audiences that can be over 4,000 people. And in the past, they've partnered with organizations such as Austin's African American Cultural Heritage District and the City of Austin's Energy and Sanitation and Fire and Parks Department. Now, since so much of creative placemaking work is now looking really at the issue of context and place, I wanted to highlight here what the place focus of this pools project is. And what Allison and Chrissy are looking at is really what we call here in Austin the Austin Eastern Crescent. And the reason it's called that is, and I show here a map of Travis County and a more specific one that shows how that geography is interpreted into the Eastern Crescent, because when demographers look at issues such as childhood obesity or displacement, these issues tend to cluster with a specific geography on the east side of the city. And so as they they were invited by the City of Austin's Parks and Recreation Department to work on the topic of the city's pools. And when they did, they knew that they really wanted to focus on this specific geography. The other important part of this project that's really important to understand is that it's not just a project about the pools and the lifeguards and the maintenance staff and the community members, but it's really one that is working to embed itself into the City of Austin's larger policy process of developing an aquatics assessment and a master plan. One of the key things to understand is that the City of Austin has some amazing pool infrastructure. There are many, many neighborhoods that have their own pool that people can walk to or get to easily. But the majority of these pools were put in about 50 years ago, and technically they should only have a 30-year lifespan. So over the past 20 years, the maintenance staff and the Parks Department has been working very hard just to keep them going, and they're at the end of those efforts. And now there are parts that that aren't available anymore, that they have to have specially made, and systems are breaking down. And unfortunately, it's happening in a context where there really isn't funding to redo all these city pools. And so the city is up against some very hard policy discussions about what to do with these. They are aquatic infrastructure, but they're very much community assets. And so the project is, I think, very bravely diving right into the middle of that policy discussion. So the project itself will roll out over 3 years. This first year, the team decided that they would focus on a pool named Bartholomew. This is a pool that's on the east side of Austin, but it has just recently been renovated. And it's a great success story. It's usually just absolutely packed. And so they began here because it has a deep history, and also that they knew that they could really figure out what it was artistically that they were doing within the context of a very strong community and a lovely facility. In years 2 and 3, they'll be working with the advisory committee to really identify two other pools, and they really want to progress into more challenging circumstances. So one thing is that so everyone knows this project is just now rolling out this first year. In fact, last Friday and Saturday, they had their first performances. They had 2 on Friday night, 2 on Saturday night, and then they're going to be doing this again tomorrow and Saturday. But I wanted to share with folks just some images of the performance so you got a sense of what this is all about. Folks enter into the pool area and they're asked to come in with their bathing suits and with towels and to dangle their feet on the edges of the pool. Then the audience members are invited to help form a line that shows what the old pool was, where it was, And as they listen to stories about how the pool broke down, and some stories of folks that swam there and their memories of the place. Then lifeguards invite people from the audience to float, and to float into the water and to just experience and be there together. And this is all happening while music from award-winning Graham Reynolds, who's a dearly beloved composer here in Austin, is very much integrated as part of the show. So what the artists do is they choreograph movements that are brought forward to them by the city staff and the community members. So the composition of the performance, the choreography, is about swim practice and racing and diving board performances by local kids, and really watching the lifeguards as they perform their rescue techniques. And in particular, the maintenance staff. And listening to them as they talk about their daily schedules, the number of pools that they serve, and the stories of the tremendous work that they do to keep the aquatic system that is so old and in need of such care alive for everyone in the community. And since we just finished these first 2 nights of performances, I pulled together some of the words that people used on the post-show survey to just describe what they saw and how the performance made them feel. So that's the general context. And now I wanted to dive in to the evaluation process. We're really looking at how do we set up Allison and Chrissy and the whole Forklift team to really move forward in the future with carrying on evaluation processes themselves. And I think Rachel mentioned that for Pillsbury House. It's about looking at what they're doing now, but also creating tools for them in the future. And so an essential component of that is really looking at developing a theory of change and developing the tools, the measures, the metrics that they can use to move forward. So to sketch a little bit of the context of the evaluation project, the theory of change project, I myself have been embedded in the project from the beginning and looking at all the different stages and components. We are very fortunate to have external support. For this first year, we have support from the LISC Technical Assistance Program. And then we feel very honored to have received an NEA research grant for years 2 and 3. And that will really help us to examine both the indicators for civic capacity building and to explore how the research process itself can become more integrated as a component of the process. And I think it's also very important to say that I think, like Rachel mentioned for Pillsbury House, there's deep internal support for this evaluation process as well within the Forklift team. The company has a history of very deep reflection, and they're always exploring ways to capture and monitor and assess the work that they're doing. And this includes working with Animating Democracy, professors at the University of Texas and Wesleyan, and developing the specific participant instruments that examine impacts for both the performers and the community. And so where we are right now is these are the initial components of the theory of change. This is not, I want to highlight, this is not the theory of change itself, but we're right in the middle of examining what are the parts. And we started out by looking at earlier iterations of their theory of change, work that they did with Clara Pinsky, looking at their strategic plan, and doing some additional visioning with the artists and staff to talk about, well, what impacts do they see? What's needed to get in place for those impacts to happen? We put all that data into a very large matrix to try and understand the overlaps and the intersections, and then we pulled out some very key outcomes and preconditions, and that's what you see here. And what we're learning is that there's really a core of Forklift's work which really looks at impacting the individual capacity, the performers, the community members that become part of the performances, and that they have an increased sense of self, an increased sense of self as a creative person, and a pride in their job. We know that as their practice has developed, that they're also seeing organizational capacity, that they have, here PARD stands for the Parks and Recreation Department, that both here and in other performances that they that there's an appreciation that people really feel. I mean, it's so palpable and wonderful, the emotions that people feel towards the city staff as they really come to understand what their job is about, how hard they work, and how much our larger system as a city depends on them. And then impacts of understanding that just the artistic process itself helps to improve communications both within and outside the department. And what we're looking at now is the civic capacity that's being built as the communities themselves start to understand not only the performance aesthetically and artistically, but that's how the performance is actually embedded within larger policy conversations. So what I wanted to introduce right now is also, since we are building the ship while we're sailing it, I wanted to talk about some of the challenges we have as we're developing a theory of change and evaluation protocols in a project that is very much evolving as we're talking. And so one of the issues that has come up is the fact that there is a growing project framework. As I mentioned earlier, Forklift has worked long and hard at trying to understand the impact of their work and how that happens. They look at the impact on community performers, the ideas about themselves and the relationship to the work, and they've even expanded that in conversations with others to understand their work in terms of community health. And now, because of the relationship to policy issues, we're looking to expand that lens once again to include civic capacity building and its impact on policy issues. So one of the challenges we have is recognizing the earlier frameworks that Forklift worked very hard on and to see if perhaps there is a core of Forklift work that happens within the theory of change that maybe we can layer as each project moves and inflects to meet its own specific context. I think here, in the image we can see here, traditionally Forklift looks at its impact on the performers. And here we see the maintenance staff and the city lifeguards that have been part of this. But now we're realizing that the performance is very much focusing on both the hyperlocal and the large-scale policy context. So we wonder, what is their impact on Parks Board members, on council members, on community activists that are really looking at this question of how we keep these civic resources of our community pools. Another challenge we're looking at is the research roles. Again, we want to be able to pass this off to Forklift when they're done. And recognize that Forklift is really, their internal culture is an all hands on deck. Everyone does everything. And so in this project, looking at impacts and evaluation, there's myself, there's interns and volunteers, there's the artists themselves, Allison and Chrissy, and the company staff, Clara and Anne. And so one challenge is that from a traditional research standpoint, we're all in this working together very closely. And so as a researcher, I need to be quite aware that there are moments when I am observing and that there are other moments when I am influencing, when I'm talking through issues and problems with everyone and making recommendations. And so we very much look to participatory action research as a frame to make sure that we're dealing well with what can sometimes be fuzzy roles. And for myself as a researcher, it just means I have to be very disciplined on recognizing which hat I'm wearing at any one moment. The other question that we have in terms of roles is that, when this project ends, we don't want to leave Allison and Chrissy or the other members of the team to suddenly become researchers. We want them to very much be engaging evaluation as artists. And so in other words, how can we develop ways that they can engage the project and that can augment their traditional roles, not change them. And I think along those lines, it's really critical to recognize the reverse question. How can their ideas and capacities as artists actually help to contribute to how the evaluation process itself rolls out? And I think we saw something akin to this, sort of as the project was developing. The project is very much guided by a strong advisory committee. And originally we thought of the advisory committee as administrative, that they were going to really help us negotiate the policy context, help us make some strategic decisions. But as we were working on the theory of change and talking through things, we really began to understand that advisory committee was part of the artistic process itself. And we could see this embodied by the fact that not only were Allison and Chrissy really thinking about their advisors as being embedded within the larger process. They approached it as a process, like say as Christo would do for one of his projects. But they were, also in terms of the basic ways that this was happening. And I think this was wonderfully illustrated when I was talking to them one time about the sheer success of the meetings. People love their advisory committee meetings. And they explained to me that one of the things that they do when they create an agenda for one of these advisory committee meetings is that they're really cognizant of the narrative arc within the agenda. And I think that's such a beautiful way of illustrating how they, as artists, and their sensibilities really influence so many aspects of the project. And it inspired me. And I know as a wonk, I've never thought of a narrative arc within a meeting agenda, but I do now. And so the other thing that we're wrestling with is specific tools. How the data input will happen once the theory of change is finalized. We're in the process right now. We're looking at traditional tools of ethnographic observations and really looking at getting those thick descriptions, semi-structured interviews, pre- and post-show surveys, and audience surveys. And but the new tools that we're looking at, again, is meeting the context of their all hands on deck type of company. And so one example that we had was we sat down with their summer interns, and we presented the theory of change and asked them, how would you gather information? They're all college age and are just right after. And their way of engaging the world, engaging information is very different than myself or Allison and Chrissy. And so we asked them, be in the field with Allison and Chrissy and really look to how you would want to capture what your observations are. And so after a couple of trials, we realized that actually one of the best ways was to capture things through a Google Doc in Car Talk. What we jokingly called Car Talk. That they, would travel to the site together and travel back. And when they were traveling back, they just decided that they would have a practice of reflecting with each other what was going on in relationship to these areas of impact that we were seeing within the theory of change and recording those. We also did Facebook captures, and we love Marty Pottinger's email trick of anytime something comes across email that we want to capture, we re-email it to ourselves or to each other. With a specific heading to make sure that this information gets captured. And so I think as we move forward, one of our challenge is that, this is for Forklift a very hyper-local endeavor. And they've had other projects that are really locally based, but not at this scale. And so that the ways that they are engaging the community are going to be very different, and they're looking intently at ways to engage non-traditional audiences. And we've been talking a lot about that before the performances, even now in between the performances, and it'll be a big focus in next year. And so we want to focus on how can we create the evaluation tools and metrics that will specifically meet these very in-depth ways of not just engaging the performers, but the larger community as well on multiple levels. So the next steps, as I mentioned, the performance will be happening, the last two nights of the performance will be happening tomorrow and Saturday. When they're done, we'll catch our breath and synthesize the data from the post-show surveys and interviews. We'll finalize the theory of change and the logic model, which we'll then look at iteratively with the staff and the Forklift board and the project advisory group. We're doing a case study write-up and a write-up about the policy context, and we'll develop the specific protocols that we want to use for years 2 and 3 that specifically measure civic capacity building. And so I think the final question that I wanted to leave is the ones that we're thinking of now as we move into year 2 is that the question of how do we develop this theory of change and this logic model in a way that we can both use and test rigorously with different instruments, but that also allows room for new thoughts and new ideas, because we know we will be gaining insight about the performance and their process as year 2 and year 3 unfold. So I welcome any questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lynn, and thank you, Rachel, again for your presentations. Now, we have a lot of questions flowing in, and the speakers will be trying to address some of those questions directly. However, we're going to also ask questions overall during the discussion time, and we have about 25 minutes for open discussion. So I'm actually going to start off by asking a few general questions, and then we'll start diving into the participants' questions. So first of all, I'm going to ask a general question to both Rachel and Lynn, which is, what are the challenges you both have faced in measuring creative placemaking projects? Now, that's a very deliberately open-ended question, but we've heard about your successes today and some of your challenges. But again, I put the question to you, what are the challenges you both have faced in measuring creative placemaking projects? And Rachel, I'll ask you to respond first.
Okay, thanks. Challenges. Well, I think one challenge that we encountered with the Pillsbury project was coming in midway through. They had already collected some data, and their tools, some of them didn't collect data that we ultimately used to answer our research question, or they were the people who took the surveys or who answered the questions, it wasn't really the target population that we wanted, or the artists who were involved, they were asked to fill out some pre and post surveys, and not all of them filled it out, and so sometimes we just had incomplete data. So I guess that would be one challenge that we encountered there, and that was to no one's fault, really, but through the technical appendix and recommendations, we tried to give some recommendations on how they could collect just better, more full data that could help answer some of these research questions. I think another challenge generally is just establishing the causal effect of this work. Creative placemaking doesn't happen in a bubble. There are a lot of other things going on, and how can you really say that, this art performance caused X, Y, or Z? And we tried to address that with our survey, with our treatment and quasi-control blocks, but even that is imperfect because, the people who lived on the quasi-control blocks aren't in a vacuum either. They could easily experience arts and culture in other venues other than their own block. So those are a couple challenges that I can think of at the moment.
Thank you, Rachel. Lynn, would you like to respond to that question?
Sure. There's two thoughts I have on that. One of them is, I think, the challenge that arts organizations and community organizations face all around, which is, to a great extent, we know that these projects and programs have longer-term impacts. Unfortunately, the ability to look at those long-term impacts often is not within the budget of the project. And so the question of how do we acknowledge that, the very real circumstance of, we are in the project, we can collect data on that now, and we might or might not be able to do it later. So how do we set up for investigating those longer-term impacts within the very real constraints of an arts organization? The other thing is I think as Rachel was mentioning, the causal effects. Sometimes within creative placemaking, they can be quite subtle. And I think of the example of something that just happened the other night. There was a Parks Board meeting for this specific pools project. And at that meeting, both the chair of the Parks Board and other members from the community really talked about the project and that Allison and Chrissy that Forklift had done, and talked about how moved they were by it, how important it was. And then later in the meeting, the parks staff presented the Aquatics Master Plan. And we know, just from past experience of being in these policy forums, that that first conversation about the project, that the fact that many of those people were either part of the performance or had seen it, were very much in the room, so to speak. And that did have an impact on how it was that the board talked about and decided upon in terms of this policy. But how exactly we measure that and capture that is actually a conversation that we're having right now. And again, I think it's, causal effect can be very hard to establish and sometimes very subtle.
Lynn and Rachel, thank you for your responses. You actually brought up a few issues that I'd like to explore a little more deeply. Rachel, you spoke about the challenge of measuring causality in creative placemaking projects. And Lynn, you were also talking about how do you assess outcomes that are really beyond the time frame of the project. These are both important issues, but they're not unique to the creative placemaking field. So are there any lessons that you've learned from other fields as to how to address the measurement of causality? And really, we're talking here ultimately long-term outcomes that may not be measurable within the project term.
Yeah, I can speak to that. I think the way I have approached it as a researcher is actually to not try and make any claims about causality, because those are so hard, but really to stay more in the realm of the thick description and how can we really create a really deep understanding about the work that is being done, the relationships that are happening within the project, and trying to very much capture how it is that the project participants discuss the work that's going on. Because I think it would be wonderful to deal with causality, but in other work that I've looked at, I think it's the realm of the very good description and calling out of relationships is some of the most the strongest impacts that I've seen to developing understanding.
And I guess I would just add that in our work we really value the qualitative and the quantitative, and so we use both to try to weave this narrative and really tell a story about the project. And so, while the survey data, which a lot of that was very quantitative, and I showed some percentages and some stats and stuff, that was valuable, but it's a pretty small sample size in the end, and we really relied on this other qualitative stories from the artists themselves to weave the story. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but I think using multiple data sources to really try to craft the story and this narrative and try to figure out what's going on based on multiple data sources.
And I just wanted to add one thing to that. One thing that I've seen is that, creative placemaking, it's arts intersecting with so many disciplines. Often those other disciplines do have a much more rigorously quantitative understanding of their work. And for example, when working with the health field or public health field, they've been looking at causality for many, many years. And so often I have seen where when creative placemaking questions can come into relationship with existing frameworks, that's an opportunity to really look at causality. I think within just the new field of creative placemaking, I think we're still building that capacity.
Thank you both for your very rich responses to that question. One question that I wanted to pose to you. There will be members of our audience who have not worked with a researcher or evaluator before in partnership with an arts project or specifically a creative placemaking project. What guidance might you offer to those that are either initiating or leading a creative placemaking project in terms of working with a researcher or an evaluator? And Lynn, would you like to take that question first?
Sure. I would say, I think one thing that came up in both mine and Rachel's presentations today was that both organizations had a very strong internal culture of wanting to get at these questions. And so I would say, like a first step is just a self-check, is like, is this part of who we are? Or is this something we really need to do? Because I think once an organization starts to ask those questions on their own, it makes it so much richer for a researcher to step in and say, let's help expand and form what it is that you all are working on, but the energy and the desire is already there.
Yeah, I would totally agree with Lynn on that. And another thing is that actually I started working with Pillsbury House as a grad student. I was in an evaluation course, and we had to do a project with a real-life organization doing work, and so we worked with Pillsbury House, and Pillsbury had already been thinking about evaluation, but that was a nice way for them. I mean, they didn't have to pay for us. We were willing to do this work for free, and as a way to kind of start exploring some of these ideas, and then that helped set the stage for when Metris came in as a paid evaluator, and Pillsbury had already been thinking about some of these questions. So potentially tapping higher ed institutions, evaluation programs to see, if there's any work to be done with those students.
Thank you both. And I hope for those of you in the audience, if there's one theme that has echoed across all the presentations today, it is about the importance of developing a conceptual framework in order to base your evaluation work on. And we heard about a theory of change. Lynn talked about conceptual frameworks. We also mentioned logic modeling. These are all critical. But if you notice, I think with each of these presentations today, that type of work was done at a different phase of the project. Lynn, it sounds like most of your work was happening early in the development of the project. With Rachel, with the project you described, it happened later in the process. So I'd like to ask, and this is particularly for those of you leading creative placemaking projects in the audience, what guidance would you offer to those individuals in terms of when to do this work? And Rachel, would you like to take that first?
Sure. So the question is when to do this evaluation work as you're doing it on the ground.
Particularly the evaluation planning, the conceptual framework, and theory of change development.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, I think, what Lynn is doing in Austin is really important and interesting, and to really get to thinking about these questions even before you begin your work, your creative placemaking work, like what are the goals, what do we want to achieve, how do we know that we've met our goals, and so I think there's real value in thinking conceptually before the work starts to happen. That said, creative placemaking, like a lot of different work, is so iterative, and you don't know what's going to happen. And so I think having a practice of really revisiting these models throughout and doing self-reflection, whether that's internally within your organization or working with an outside evaluator to do that reflection, is really valuable. Pillsbury engaged us to do an outcomes evaluation because they had already done a lot of this work, but part of our evaluation was also a process evaluation. They were interested in, and I mentioned that there were a whole bunch of different kinds of arts and culture projects. They were interested, so which ones are the ones that are most effective in increasing these feelings of access, attachment, agency. And so we were able to surface some themes around what the most successful projects, those ingredients that they had in common. And so that was useful for them as they kept doing this work. So it was a useful check in the middle.
Thank you, Rachel. And Lynn, since the approach you took was quite different because it did begin at the beginning of the process, would you like to comment on that as well?
Yes, I have felt very lucky to be part of the process with Forklift, of really helping them explore their artistic process as it develops. And I think we've really come to understand that this particular project is quite different from other ones that they've done in the past. I think Rachel really hit on it, that the creative placemaking work so often is iterative. And I can see strategically an arts organization, a company, getting to an end of the project and knowing that they're going to do a project like that in the future. I think that's a great time to come in and bring an evaluator in at the end to really deeply, reflectively look on what they've done and set them up for the next stage. If a company or an organization is really doing something new, it's a wonderful process to really be thinking deeply about evaluation from the beginning. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, we've been very lucky. We have support from LISC and in the future from NEA Research Grant. So we consider ourselves fortunate in that context. But we know that that's not always the case. And so I think the idea of looking for those opportunities when you know that you can apply and specifically test whatever it is that you come up with in another performance, another show, another project iteration.
Thank you both for responding to those questions. I'd now like to offer you a couple questions that have been brought up by audience members. And first of all, I'm going to ask a question from Lisa, who poses this question. Does anyone care to speculate on how placemaking evaluation we need to respond to the, quote, new normal, unquote, in terms of national and federal funding? And I'm making an assumption here, Lisa, that you're referring to often the fairly rigorous evaluation requirements that accompany funding in other disciplines, such as education, labor. Lynn or Rachel, I'll open the floor if either of you would like to take a crack at that question.
Yeah, I can, speak to the context of in the Forklift project. They did have very, very clear, very well-defined survey instruments before this particular project. And so those have, we really, it's not exactly the same context in which you're talking about, but, just looking at, if there's a very detailed set of evaluation already in place, we really look to, that's fine. How do we build on that and from that and recognize that just as part of the complicated context that the policy work is, the deep community engagement, that it all comes in there as part of the same thing. Admittedly, it is not easy, but, and the larger context, I mean. So I think it can be just, just sort of full steam ahead. We do what we need to do.
And I think that, it's the better that we can tell these stories around the impacts of creative placemaking, I think, the better. And potentially that if we tell these stories, and especially if we tell the stories about how these different sectors are involved in creative placemaking, then I think that could potentially open up, these different funding opportunities. And so, evaluation can be a really effective tool to help you tell these stories, because you can talk about some of the impacts, both qualitative and quantitative. So I think it's about, really effectively telling the story of your work.
And I'll just follow up with that. I think that's a great comment, because so for so many, not the folks here in this webinar, but for folks outside of these disciplines, it's still hard to communicate about what creative placemaking is exactly and what it does. So any perspectives from the outside that we can use to describe it can be helpful.
Thank you both. I'm going to take a question now from Selena. Selena writes, I appreciate the focus from the NEA on systems change, but it appears that evaluations are mainly concerned with cultural dispositions of community members, such as sense of attachment and agency. how are we as a field pushing ourselves to address systems? Rachel, would you like to take that first?
Sure. I think that we were interested in these feelings of individual attachment and agency and access, but also these larger, I guess, community feelings of those things too, because, individuals, great if they feel like they can make change in their community, but I think it's also happening at a systems level too, like we asked about their desire and ability to participate in other civic practices, and if being involved in arts and culture changed that perception of feeling like they were able to participate in civic practices. So I don't know if I'm answering that question. I think that yes, like our work and Lynn too is talking about a specific organization and their work, but I think that some of it can be applied, to larger systems too. Lynn, go ahead.
Okay, sure. I think it's a great question, and I think it's like one of the reasons why this time in creative placemaking is so exciting is because people really are now looking at the systems level. What does this mean when we look structurally at the way our communities and our cities and that these come together? And it's challenging. I think it's the question of where we are right now at the moment in this field, and I think we all have to build that ship while we're sailing it. I know in the forklift piece we are really actively looking at that because we know that the project is setting out with the intention to impact the policy conversation around the Aquatics Master Plan. What does that mean? How do we create community meetings after the performances that get at these issues, recognizing that the artists are not staff of the city, nor should they take that role? How can they keep their work as artists within the context of a very different structure, a very different system, but still be there with all the genius and the deep love that they have for their work there in the moment? And I think it's the question of where we are right now.
Thank you both. Wonderful answers. And we have time for one last question. And I'm going to take a question from Wendy, who asks, so much creative placemaking work is highly emergent work in complex environments. As an on-the-ground practitioner, it often makes best sense to apply an iterative development or evaluation strategy rather than measuring against a predefined theory framework. What have you found is a constructive relationship between theory of change, logic modeling practices, and a developmental approach? And Lynn, I'm going to ask you to respond to this question because I think your work probably most mirrors this approach. Lynn?
So I'll be honest, the first thing that popped into my head as I was listening to the question was just a sense of humor. It's exactly that. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to be wrestling with here in Austin for year two. Part of our process of developing the theory of change has been really looking at it iteratively, like within the context of the process itself, and that there are these emergent themes, emergent understandings. How can we develop a theory of change that both honors the past work that the company has done and leaves room for inflections for new projects and even inflections within those projects? And so, again, I think I don't have a definitive answer, but I think the question is spot on and something we all just need to hold while we work.
Yeah, and I think that makes someone like Lynn in her position so important because the artist they have someone who they can bounce things off of or ask advice of, and there's someone, following them and watching this thing develop from the outside. So I think, that's a really, having a Lynn on your team is really valuable.
Thank you both. And I want to thank the audience members as well for submitting such high quality questions And I think our speakers are going to try to respond to some of the speaker-specific questions as well. So keep your eye on the Q&A column. And also, again, there's some great questions that were phrased, which are actually very useful information as well for all participants. Now I'm going to take the opportunity to introduce Catherine Bray-Simons from the NEA. Catherine works in our design office, and she's going to speak about a funding opportunity that might be of particular interest to evaluators. Catherine.
Hi, everyone, and thanks so much, Patricia. Again, my name is Catherine Bray-Simons, and I'm a design specialist here at the NEA. I run the Our Town program. The Our Town grant application deadline is coming up this September, so I wanted to jump on here at the end just to highlight a funding stream we have within our town. It's called Projects That Build Knowledge About Creative Placemaking. We call this knowledge building for short. And yeah, like Patricia said, I think this may be of particular interest to some of you who are listening in on this presentation today. So just some quick background on this category within our town. We launched this relatively new program area in 2015 with an intention of really expanding and strengthening the field of creative placemaking. And particularly, we're hoping to build the capacity of arts-based practitioners and organizations to collaborate effectively with practitioners and organizations that are engaged in place-based community development work. So really, while our longer-standing funding has been about creative placemaking projects that are happening in place, these investments through knowledge building are more about sparking cross-pollination of skills, of approaches, of ideas between arts and culture and community development practitioners. So these projects really target national or regional professional networks to seed that knowledge and that skill exchange. And this can take place through a range of activities, things like peer exchange programs, development of toolkits, publishing research, technical assistance programs, and so on. We've got descriptions of the 27 past funded knowledge building projects on our website, and I urge you to check those out. But just to give you a quick example, just to give you a feel for what these can look like, we funded a partnership between the American Planning Association and a Minneapolis-based organization called Forecast Public Art to develop learning tools that will help urban planners think about how public art can serve as a strategy for them as they design for improved health outcomes in the communities where they're working. So I'm plugging this opportunity for you all here because, honestly, we'd love to have some evaluators join this cohort of grantees. Please come to the Creative Placemaking Party. We're having so much fun. We believe that for the creative placemaking field to grow and mature, we'll really need to keep bringing the kinds of questions in that evaluators raise, and I think our speakers really illuminated that today in their presentations. So yeah, we'd love to see the interest and engagement in creative placemaking work and research questions expand among networks and associations of evaluators who are working both in the arts but also in community development fields. So here I've just outlined a couple of the nitty-gritty highlights about these grants. They range in funding amounts from $25,000 to $100,000. The NEA requires a one-to-one non-federal match with those. The lead applicant must be a 501c3 nonprofit and must have at least 3 years of programming history behind it. And these are partnership grants, so you can read more about this in the guidelines, but partners need to have a kind of a complementary expertise that they're bringing to the mix. But the partner entity could be an organization, it could be a business, a consultant, an individual. There's some flexibility there. Again, the deadline is September 11, 2017. Here's a quick view of the application and award timeline. So there's the deadline on September 11. We review applications through the fall, winter, spring, And projects that are funded in this round can start as early as August 1, 2018, and these projects generally last for around 2 years. So definitely check out the guidelines if you want to learn more, and please absolutely reach out to us. The email address you see on the screen is the best place to reach us with questions about our town and about the knowledge building opportunity in particular. That email address is ot@arts.gov. Our team monitors that inbox. We're really eager to hear from you and happy to respond to you, usually within around 2 business days. And so looking very much forward to hearing from you all with your interest.
Thank you, Catherine. And Catherine, we did have one question that came in. What is the ideal amount of partners? 3 to 4? Can it be more than 4 partners?
Thanks for asking that question. Great question. So it's very common with our town projects to see lots of partners coming into the mix and to be featured in the application. The required partnership is 2 entities, so that nonprofit organization and a partner, a consulting partner. But in addition, we very frequently see lots of community partners and others that are going to play a role in carrying out these projects. Great question.
Thank you, Catherine, for this presentation and for this special invitation to evaluators to apply. So again, thanks to everyone who joined us for today's webinar, and a special thanks to our 2 guest presenters, Rachel Engh and Lynn Osgood. I think we all enjoyed your presentations today. Now, this webinar will be archived on the NEA website, and especially for those of you who came in past our cap and didn't have full access to the audio or experienced audio problems, you'll be able to hear the original webinar in its pure form on our website. We invite you to attend future research and evaluation webinars, which will be announced on our website as well. Thank you very much.